Venezuela didn't expect what was waiting beneath the surface. Let me take you back to January 22, 2024, not the date of some grand summit or a high-profile assassination, but the day Venezuela's navy intercepted a small, unremarkable vessel in the Essequibo region. On the surface, it was just another routine patrol, a minor incident in a long-running territorial dispute. The Venezuelan government, as expected, framed it as a triumph of sovereignty, a bold stand against foreign encroachment. The media dutifully reported it as a minor skirmish, a footnote in the ongoing saga of Guyana's oil boom and Venezuela's economic collapse. But here's the thing: I've spent the last 3 decades studying the way great powers manipulate crises, how resource conflicts escalate into geopolitical flashpoints, and how the groundwork for war is often laid years before the first shot is fired. And what happened that day wasn't just another border dispute. It was the first tremor of something far bigger, something that could reshape the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela didn't just stumble into this crisis. It walked right into a trap, and what's waiting beneath the surface is far more dangerous than anyone in Caracas, Washington, or Beijing is letting on. Now, let's start with the official narrative, because that's always where the deception begins. According to the story we're supposed to believe, this is a simple case of a desperate regime clinging to legitimacy. Venezuela, under Nicolas Maduro, has spent the last decade watching its economy implode, its people flee, and its oil production collapse. The Essequibo region, a swath of jungle and coastline roughly the size of Florida, claimed by both Venezuela and Guyana, has suddenly become the center of attention because ExxonMobil, in partnership with Guyana's government, discovered massive offshore oil reserves there. By 2023, Guyana was producing over 600,000 barrels a day, with projections to hit 1.2 million by 2027. For a country of just 800,000 people, that's an economic revolution. For Venezuela, it's an existential threat. Maduro's response has been textbook strongman politics. In December 2023, he held a referendum widely dismissed as rigged, where 95% of voters allegedly supported annexing Essequibo. He then published new maps showing the region as part of Venezuela, sent troops to the border, and even announced plans to grant oil licenses to commies willing to operate in the disputed zone. The U.S. and its allies condemned the moves as reckless, while Guyana's president, Irfan Ali, called it a direct threat to his country's sovereignty. The UN, the OAS, and the International Court of Justice all weighed in, urging restraint. By all appearances, this was just another case of a failing regime manufacturing a crisis to distract from its own failures. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. Because if you dig beneath the surface, if you look at the timing, the players involved, and the geopolitical chessboard, what's really happening here is far more calculated, far more dangerous, and far more revealing about the state of the world than most people realize. This isn't just about oil. It's about the death of American hegemony, the rise of a new multipolar order, and the way great powers are now fighting proxy wars not with tanks and soldiers, but with energy, debt, and legal warfare. And Venezuela? It's not the aggressor here. It's the pawn. Let me tell you what's really going on. First, the oil. Yes, Guyana's reserves are massive, some of the largest new discoveries in the world this century. But here's the part they're not telling: ExxonMobil didn't just stumble upon this oil by accident. The Comey has been drilling in the region since 2015, and it did so with the full backing of the U.S. government. Why? Because Washington has spent the last decade trying to wean itself off Venezuelan oil, and Guyana's reserves are a perfect replacement. In 2019, the Trump administration imposed crushing sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, effectively cutting off Caracas from the global market. The goal was regime change, pure and simple. But the sanctions didn't work. Maduro didn't fall. Instead, he turned to Russia and China for lifelines, loans, oil-for-goods deals, military support. And that's when the U.S. started looking for alternatives. Enter Guyana. By 2020, Exxon had already made its first major discovery, and by 2023, Guyana was exporting more oil than Venezuela. The U.S. Energy Information Administration now projects that Guyana will be producing 1.2 million barrels a day by 2027, more than Venezuela at its peak. And here's the: nearly all of that oil is being sold to the U.S. and its allies. In 2023, Guyana exported over 60% of its crude to Europe, helping replace Russian oil after the Ukraine war. So when Maduro started making noise about Essequibo, it wasn't just about national pride. It was about survival. Because if Guyana keeps pumping oil at this rate, Venezuela's already crippled economy will be completely irrelevant in the global energy market. But the oil is only half the story. The other half is about something even more: rare earth minerals. And this is where things get really interesting. For years, geologists have known that the Essequibo region is rich in gold, diamonds, and bauxite. But in 2022, a team of Chinese researchers working with Guyana's government discovered something far more: massive deposits of rare earth elements, including neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. These are the minerals that power everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to missile guidance systems. And right now, China controls over 80% of the global supply. The US has been desperate to break that monopoly, and Guyana's reserves could be the answer. In 2023, the Biden administration signed a defense cooperation agreement with Guyana, pledging military support in exchange for access to these minerals. The Chinese, of course, are already there building roads, ports, and mining infrastructure. So when Maduro started talking about annexing Essequibo, he wasn't just threatening Guyana's oil. He was threatening the entire US-China competition for the future of technology. Now, let's talk about the geopolitical chessboard, because this is where the real game is being played. What we're seeing in Venezuela isn't just a local conflict. It's a microcosm of the new Cold War, a struggle between the US, China, and Russia for control of the Western Hemisphere. And each of these powers is playing a very different game. Let's start with the US. For decades, Washington has treated Latin America as its backyard, a sphere of influence where it could intervene at will. But that era is over. The US is now facing a multipolar world where China and Russia are actively challenging its dominance. In Venezuela, the US has tried everything: sanctions, coups, even a failed drone assassination attempt on Maduro in 2018. Nothing has worked. So now, the Biden administration is trying a different containment. The goal isn't to overthrow Maduro anymore. It's to isolate him, to make sure Venezuela doesn't become a full-fledged client state of China or Russia. That's why the US has been so supportive of Guyana, because Guyana is a US ally, a democracy, and a counterweight to Venezuelan influence. And if Maduro makes a move on Essequibo? The US has already made it clear it will defend Guyana militarily. In December 2023, the US Southern Command conducted joint military exercises with Guyana's forces. In January 2024, the US sent a destroyer to patrol Guyana's waters. This isn't just posturing. It's a red line. Then there's China. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America for years, and Venezuela is its crown jewel. Since 2007, China has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, most of it in exchange for oil. When the US imposed sanctions, China stepped in, buying Venezuelan crude at a discount and helping Maduro circumvent the restrictions. But China's interests go beyond oil. It sees Venezuela as a strategic partner in its Belt and Road Initiative, a way to project power into the Western Hemisphere. And now, with the discovery of rare earth minerals in Essequibo, China has even more reason to keep Maduro in power. In 2023, China and Venezuela signed a 25-year cooperation agreement, including plans to develop Venezuela's own rare earth deposits. So when Maduro talks about annexing Essequibo, he's not just acting on his own. He's doing it with China's blessing and China's money. And then there's Russia. Moscow's involvement in Venezuela is more about geopolitical leverage than economic gain. Since 2019, Russia has sent military advisors, Wagner Group mercenaries, and even nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela. The goal? To remind the US that if it wants to play hardball in Ukraine, Russia can play hardball in America's backyard. In 2023, Russia and Venezuela signed a new military cooperation agreement, including joint naval exercises in the Caribbean. And when Maduro held his referendum on Essequibo, Russian state media was the first to hail it as a victory for Venezuelan sovereignty. So if the US decides to intervene militarily in Guyana, Russia has already made it clear it will respond either directly or through proxies. Now, let's talk about the military implications, because this is where things get really dangerous. The US has been preparing for a potential conflict in Venezuela for years. In 2019, the Trump administration drew up plans for a military intervention, including a naval blockade and airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets. Those plans were shelved, but they're still on the table. In 2023, the U.S. Southern Command conducted a series of wargames simulating a Venezuelan invasion of Guyana. The results? A U.S. victory, but at a high cost. Venezuela's military is weak, but it's backed by Russia and China. And if the U.S. gets bogged down in a protracted conflict, it could embolden other adversaries like Iran in the Middle East or North Korea in Asia. But here's the U.S. military isn't the only player here. China has been quietly building up its own military presence in the region. In 2023, China opened its first overseas military base in Djibouti, and there are reports that it's looking to establish a similar base in Venezuela. Russia, meanwhile, has been using Venezuela as a testing ground for its electronic warfare and cyber capabilities. In 2022, Russian hackers launched a series of cyber attacks on Guyana's government, disrupting its oil operations. So if the US does decide to intervene, it won't just be fighting Venezuela. It will be fighting a proxy war against China and Russia. And that's where the real danger lies. Because the US has a long history of underestimating its adversaries. In Iraq, it thought it could topple Saddam Hussein in weeks. In Afghanistan, it thought it could build a democracy in a decade. In Libya, it thought it could overthrow Gaddafi without creating a failed state. And in each case, it was wrong. So when I hear hawks in Washington talking about a quick and easy intervention in Venezuela, I get nervous. Because the last thing the US needs right now is another forever war, especially one that could escalate into a direct confrontation with China or Russia. But the military dimension is only part of the story. The other part is domestic politics, because in the US, foreign policy is always shaped by elections. And right now, Venezuela is becoming a political football in the 2024 presidential race. Let's start with the Biden administration. In 2020, Biden campaigned on a promise to restore democracy in Venezuela. But by 2023, it was clear that Maduro wasn't going anywhere. So the administration shifted its strategy. Instead of regime change, it started negotiating with Maduro, offering sanctions relief in exchange for free elections. In October 2023, the U.S. agreed to ease some sanctions, and Maduro released a handful of political prisoners. But the deal fell apart when Maduro refused to allow opposition candidates to run in the 2024 election. So now, the Biden administration is back to square one, stuck between a rock and a hard place. If it does nothing, it looks weak. If it intervenes militarily, it risks another quagmire. And if it tries to negotiate again, it will be accused of appeasement. Then there's Donald Trump. In 2019, Trump came within a whisker of launching a military strike on Venezuela. He was talked out of it at the last minute, but he's never hidden his desire to take a harder line. In 2023, he called Maduro a dictator and promised to crush his regime if he's re-elected. And here's the Trump has a puh: the US can't just ignore Venezuela. But the question is, what's the endgame? Because if the US does intervene, it will be doing so at a time when its military is already stretched thin, supporting Ukraine, containing China, and deterring Iran. And if the intervention goes wrong, it could be a disaster for Biden's re-election campaign. So where does that leave us? Let's look at the possible scenarios. Scenario: the best case. In this scenario, Maduro backs down. He realizes that invading Guyana would be a disaster economically, militarily, and politically. The US and its allies impose targeted sanctions, but they don't escalate. China and Russia stay out of it, and the status quo is maintained. Guyana keeps pumping oil, Venezuela stays isolated, and the crisis fades into the background. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. Because Maduro has already burned his bridges with the US, and he knows that if he backs down now, he'll look weak. And in the world of strongmen, weakness is death. Scenario: the most likely. In this scenario, Maduro makes a limited move, maybe seizing a small part of Essequibo, or harassing Guyanese oil platforms. The US responds with sanctions and military support for Guyana, but it stops short of direct intervention. China and Russia provide diplomatic cover for Maduro, but they don't get directly involved. The conflict becomes a frozen crisis like Ukraine before 2022, or Taiwan today. Guyana's oil production is disrupted, but not destroyed. Venezuela's economy continues to stagnate, and the region remains a powder keg. This is the most likely scenario, but it's also the most unstable. Because frozen conflicts have a way of thawing, and when they do, they often explode. Scenario: the worst case. In this scenario, Maduro goes all in. He invades Essequibo, seizing the oil fields and rare earth mines. The US responds with a military intervention, first with airstrikes, then with ground troops. China and Russia provide weapons and intelligence to Venezuela, and the conflict escalates into a regional war. Guyana's government collapses, and the US finds itself bogged down in another counterinsurgency campaign. Meanwhile, China uses the crisis as an opportunity to extend its influence in Latin America, and Russia uses it to distract the US from Ukraine. The global economy is thrown into chaos, and the US emerges weaker than ever. This is the worst-case scenario, but it's not impossible. Because when great powers start playing with fire, they often get burned. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. Because what's happening in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the death of American hegemony, and the rise of a new multipolar world. For decades, the US has operated under the assumption that it can shape the world in its image. It has invaded countries, overthrown governments, and imposed its will on weaker nations, all in the name of democracy and free markets. But that era is over. The US is no longer the sole superpower. It's now one of three, competing with China and Russia for global influence. And in this new world, the old rules don't apply. The US can't just invade Venezuela and expect to get away with it. Because China and Russia will respond. They'll provide weapons, they'll provide intelligence, and they'll make sure the US pays a price. And that's the problem with American foreign policy today. It's still operating under the assumption that the US can do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. But the world has changed. And if the US doesn't adapt, it's going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. So what should the US do instead? Let me tell you what I've been arguing for years. First, the US needs to accept that it can't control everything. It can't overthrow every regime it doesn't like, and it can't impose its will on every country. Instead, it needs to focus on its core interests, protecting its allies, securing its energy supplies, and containing its adversaries. In Venezuela, that means supporting Guyana, but not intervening militarily. It means using sanctions as a tool, not a weapon. And it means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not anytime soon. Second, the US needs to stop seeing China and Russia as enemies to be defeated. They're competitors, not adversaries. And in a multipolar world, the US needs to learn how to manage competition without resorting to war. That means engaging with China on climate change, on trade, and on global governance. It means working with Russia on arms control and regional stability. And it means accepting that the world is no longer unipolar. Third, the US needs to stop outsourcing its foreign policy to corporations. ExxonMobil didn't discover oil in Guyana by accident. It did so with the full backing of the US government. And now, the US is in a position where it has to defend Exxon's interests even if it means going to war. That's a recipe for disaster. The US needs to stop letting corporations dictate its foreign policy, and start thinking about the long-term consequences of its actions. Finally, the US needs to stop pretending that it can have it all. It can't be the world's policeman, the world. Here's the uncomfortable truth: America's foreign policy establishment still hasn't learned the lessons of Iraq, Afghanistan, or even Vietnam. They act like the world is a chessboard where the US gets to move all the pieces, when in reality, it's more like a game of Jenga where every move risks toppling the whole structure. And right now, Venezuela is one of those precarious blocks that could send everything crashing down. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about oil or territorial disputes. It's about the slow-motion collapse of American deterrence. For decades, the US has relied on the assumption that its military power alone would keep adversaries in check. But what happens when that power is no longer decisive? What happens when a country like Venezuela, broke, isolated, and desperate, calls Washington's bluff and still comes out ahead? Let me explain why this matters. The Essequibo crisis isn't just a regional spat, it's a test case for how the US responds when its traditional tools of coercion fail. Sanctions? Venezuela has survived them for years, thanks to Chinese and Russian lifelines. Military threats? Maduro knows the US isn't going to invade, not after Iraq, not after Afghanistan, not when the American public is sick of forever wars. So what's left? Diplomacy? The US has burned too many bridges for that to work. And that's the Washington is running out of options, and its adversaries know it. Here's where the military implications get really dangerous. The US has spent the last 2 decades fighting insurgencies in the Middle East, but the next war, if it comes, won't look like that. It'll be a high-tech, high-stakes confrontation in the Caribbean, the South China Sea, or Eastern Europe, where the rules of engagement are completely different. And right now, the US isn't ready. Take the Navy, for example. The US still has the most powerful fleet in the world, but it's stretched thin. The Pacific Fleet is focused on China, the Atlantic Fleet is dealing with Russia, and the Southern Command responsible for Latin America is an afterthought. That's why, when Maduro started making noise about Essequibo, the US had to scramble just to send a few ships to Guyana for a show of force. It was a classic case of too little, too late. And then there's the issue of allies. The US keeps talking about building coalitions, but in Latin America, it's losing ground fast. Brazil, Argentina, and even Colombia, traditionally US partners, are hedging their bets. Brazil's Lula has been cozying up to China, Argentina's Milei is unpredictable, and Colombia's Petro is openly hostile to US policy. That leaves Guyana as the only reliable partner in the region, and Guyana is tiny. If the US wants to project power in the Caribbean, it's going to need more than just a few flyovers and port calls. Now, let's talk about Russia and China. They're not just sitting on the sidelines, they're actively shaping the battlefield. Russia has been supplying Venezuela with arms for years, everything from Kalashnikovs to Su-30 fighter jets. And China? It's not just buying Venezuelan oil, it's building the infrastructure to make sure that oil keeps flowing, no matter what the US does. The Chinese have invested billions in Venezuela's energy sector, and they're not about to let a little thing like US sanctions get in the way. But here's the neither Russia nor China wants a war. They're playing a different game, one where they erode US influence without firing a shot. Every time the US imposes sanctions, they step in with a loan or a trade deal. Every time the US threatens military action, they offer security guarantees. And every time the US tries to isolate Venezuela, they offer a lifeline. It's a slow, methodical process, and it's working. So what does this mean for the US? It means that the old playbook is obsolete. You can't just sanction a country into submission anymore. You can't just threaten military action and expect compliance. And you can't just assume that your allies will follow your lead. The world has changed, and the US needs to change with it. Let me be, I'm not saying the US should retreat into isolationism. That would be just as dangerous as the current approach. What I'm saying is that the US needs to be smarter about how it uses its power. It needs to stop treating every crisis as an existential threat and start thinking about long-term strategy. It needs to stop seeing every adversary as a mortal enemy and start looking for areas of cooperation. And it needs to stop pretending that it can do everything alone. Take Venezuela, for example. The US could start by toning down the rhetoric. Instead of calling Maduro a dictator and demanding regime change, it could focus on de-escalating the crisis. It could offer sanctions relief in exchange for concessions on Essequibo. It could work with Brazil and Colombia to mediate the dispute. And it could accept that, for now, Maduro isn't going anywhere. But that's not how Washington works. Washington is addicted to confrontation. It's addicted to the idea that the US is always right and everyone else is always wrong. And that's why, when Venezuela did the unthinkable and called its bluff, the US didn't know how to respond. It's why, when China and Russia stepped in to fill the void, the US was caught flat-footed. And it's why, if the US doesn't change course, it's going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. The bottom line? The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but its power is fading. And if it doesn't adapt, it's going to wake up one day and realize that the world has moved on without it. Venezuela is just the beginning. The real test is coming, and it's going to be a lot bigger than a few 100,000 barrels of oil. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's defiance isn't just about geopolitics, it's about domestic survival. Maduro's government has spent the last decade perfecting a system of control that doesn't rely on popularity, but on raw coercion, economic compartmentalization, and a carefully cultivated sense of inevitability. The opposition, for all its noise, has never truly threatened his grip on power because it's never offered a viable alternative. And that's not an accident. It's the result of a deliberate strategy. Let me explain why this matters. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president, the US and its allies recognized him almost instantly. The narrative was Maduro is illegitimate, the opposition is the future, and regime change is just around the corner. But here's the uncomfortable: Guaidó's moment passed almost as quickly as it arrived. By 2020, his approval ratings had collapsed, his coalition had fractured, and Maduro was still in Miraflores Palace. The reason? The opposition never had a plan beyond waiting for the US to do the heavy lifting. Maduro, on the other hand, has spent years dismantling the opposition's infrastructure. He jailed Leopoldo López, exiled Maria Corina Machado, and co-opted or crushed every major opposition party. The 2020 parliamentary elections were a farce, but they gave Maduro a veneer of legitimacy while ensuring that the opposition had no institutional foothold. The US called it a sham, but the reality is that Maduro outmaneuvered his enemies by making them irrelevant. Now, fast forward to 2024. The opposition is back, but it's a shadow of what it once was. Machado won the primary in October 2023 with 92% of the vote, but she's been barred from running. The US has responded by reimposing sanctions, but Maduro isn't blinking. Why? Because he knows something: Washington refuses to. Elections in Venezuela aren't about winning. They're about survival. Here's how it works. Maduro allows just enough opposition activity to keep the US and the EU engaged, but not enough to pose a real threat. He lets Machado campaign, but he ensures she can't win. He releases political prisoners, but only the ones who no longer matter. And he does it all while maintaining the loyalty of the military, the police, and the colectivos, armed civilian groups that act as his enforcers. The military is the key. In 2019, when Guaidó tried to rally the armed forces to his side, he failed because Maduro had already bought them off. How? By giving them control of the country's most lucrative gold, oil, and food distribution. The generals don't care about ideology. They care about money. And as long as Maduro keeps the cash flowing, they'll keep him in power. But here's where it gets interesting. Maduro's control isn't absolute. The economy is a disaster. Inflation is still in the triple digits. The bolivar is worthless. And despite the sanctions relief from the US, oil production is barely half of what it was in 1998. The only reason Maduro hasn't collapsed is because he's mastered the art of economic triage. He lets the private sector operate in the shadows, he turns a blind eye to smuggling, and he relies on remittances from the millions of Venezuelans who fled the country. Now, let's talk about the scenarios. There are three possible paths forward, and none of them are good for the US. The first is the status quo. Maduro holds on, the opposition remains divided, and the US keeps oscillating between sanctions and half-hearted negotiations. This is the most likely outcome, but it's also the most unstable. Venezuela's economy is a ticking time bomb. If oil prices crash or if Maduro miscalculates and provokes a real crisis, the country could implode. And if that happens, the US will have to decide whether to intervene or watch as millions more Venezuelans flee north. The second scenario is a negotiated transition. The US lifts sanctions, Maduro steps down, and a unity government takes over. This is what the Biden administration has been pushing for, But it's a fantasy. Maduro has no incentive to leave. He's not Pinochet. He's not going to retire to a beach house in Miami. He's going to fight to the end because he knows that if he loses power, he'll end up in The Hague. The third scenario is the most a military coup. The generals have the guns, and they've seen what happens when leaders overstay their welcome. If Maduro pushes them too far, if he tries to purge the military, or if he loses control of the economy, they could turn on him. But a coup wouldn't solve anything. It would just replace one authoritarian with another, and it could plunge the country into chaos. So where does that leave us? The US is stuck. It can't force Maduro out, but it can't accept him either. And the longer this standoff continues, the more Venezuela slips into the orbit of China and Russia. That's the real cost of Washington's failure. Every day that Maduro stays in power is another day that the US loses influence in Latin America. I'm not saying the US should give up on Venezuela. But it needs to stop pretending that there's a quick fix. The opposition isn't ready. The military isn't going to defect. And Maduro isn't going to surrender. The only way forward is a long-term strategy that combines pressure with engagement. That means targeted sanctions, not blanket ones. It means working with allies like Brazil and Colombia to contain the crisis, not escalating it. And it means accepting that, for now, Maduro is here to stay. The question is whether Washington has the patience for that. Because if it doesn't, Venezuela isn't just going to be a problem for the US. It's going to be a disaster for the entire region. And by then, it'll be too late to do anything about it. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just a failure of policy, it's a failure of imagination. The West, particularly the United States, has spent decades treating Latin America as a chessboard where the rules are democracy good, authoritarianism bad, and economic liberalization the cure for all ills. But Venezuela has exposed the limits of that thinking. The country isn't just a cautionary tale about socialism or corruption. It's a living laboratory of what happens when grand strategy collides with messy, human reality. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The Biden administration's approach, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and half-hearted support for the opposition has been a masterclass in how not to handle a collapsing state. Take the 2023 Barbados Agreement, for instance. The U.S. brokered a deal where Maduro agreed to hold fairer elections in exchange for sanctions relief. The problem? Maduro never had any intention of playing by the rules. Within months, he barred the opposition's strongest candidate, Maria Corina Machado, from running, and the U.S. responded by reimposing some, but not all, sanctions. It was a classic case of strategic too much pressure to be effective, too little to force change. The message to Maduro was the U.S. is more interested in appearing tough than in actually solving the problem. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. doesn't have a Venezuela strategy. It has a Venezuela posture. And postures don't win wars, geopolitical or otherwise. The real question isn't whether Maduro will fall, it's whether the US can afford to keep pretending that he's the only problem. Because the deeper issue is that Venezuela's collapse has created a power vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. China and Russia have been more than happy to fill it. China's involvement is particularly instructive. Since 2007, Beijing has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, most of it secured against oil. That's not charity, it's a long-term bet on Venezuela's resources. When Maduro defaulted on those loans, China didn't cut its losses. Instead, it restructured the debt, took control of oil fields, and even sent in its own engineers to keep the industry afloat. Meanwhile, Russia has turned Venezuela into a forward operating base for its Wagner Group mercenaries and a testing ground for its disinformation campaigns. The 2019 coup attempt against Maduro? Russian intelligence likely knew about it before the US did. And when the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela's gold sector in 2020, Russia stepped in, helping Maduro smuggle gold through Turkey and the UAE to bypass the restrictions. This isn't just about influence, it's about architecture. China and Russia aren't just propping up Maduro, they're building an alternative economic and security order in Latin America. The Belt and Road Initiative's action into the region, the growing presence of Russian military advisors in Nicaragua, the way China has turned AMA into a logistics hub, these aren't isolated incidents. They're pieces of a larger puzzle. And the US is still trying to solve it with tools from the 1990s. So what are the alternatives? Let's start with the one no one in Washington wants to talk: containment. The US can't fix Venezuela, but it can stop the crisis from spreading. That means working with Brazil's Lula and Colombia's Petro, not to overthrow Maduro, but to manage the fallout. It means investing in regional infrastructure to reduce dependence on Venezuelan oil. It means accepting that, for now, the best outcome isn't a democratic Venezuela but a stable one. That's not idealism, it's realpolitik. Then there's the nuclear, recognizing that Maduro isn't going anywhere and cutting a deal. The US could offer sanctions relief in exchange for free elections, but with a twist: Maduro gets immunity from prosecution, and the opposition gets a real shot at power. It's ugly, but it's not without precedent. The US did something similar with the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, where former terrorists were given political roles in exchange for peace. The difference? In Venezuela, the terrorists are still in charge. The third alternative is the one the US keeps flirting with but never fully commits: regime change from within. The military is the only institution with the power to remove Maduro, but it's also the most fractured. The generals aren't ideologues, they're opportunists. If the US wants them to turn on Maduro, it needs to give them a reason. That could mean offering amnesty, guaranteeing their assets abroad, or even promising a role in a transitional government. But it also means accepting that the next leader of Venezuela might not be a Democrat. It might be a general who rules with an iron fist but keeps the country from becoming a failed state. That's a bitter pill to swallow, but it's better than the alternative. Here's the thing about Grand: it's not about what you want. It's about what you can live with. The US wants a democratic Venezuela, but it's going to have to settle for a less bad one. It wants to isolate Maduro, but it's going to have to engage with him. It wants to be the leader of the free world, but it's going to have to share the hemisphere with China and Russia. That's not defeatism, it's maturity. I'll leave you with this. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president, the US and over 50 other countries recognized him. It was a high watermark for the opposition, but it was also the moment when the West's Venezuela strategy jumped the shark. Because recognition without power is just theater. And theater doesn't feed people, stop migration, or keep China out of the Caribbean. Venezuela didn't expect what was waiting beneath the surface. Neither did the US. The question now is whether Washington can adapt or whether it's doomed to keep repeating the same mistakes, while the rest of the world moves on.